You get the property back, but they have no personal liability. And ultimately, the Michigan Supreme Court said, no, no, no. There's not an election of remedies. And so he went ahead and sued the buyer for breach of contract. Who would want the land back? All right, so there could be instances where you'd say, I don't want the property back. I'm just going to sue you. So that's one of the other alternatives that's there. Now, that's a civil action. Those usually take a few years as well. Okay.
I have one question.
Sure.
On item 3, I don't know if maybe I didn't get it, but possession of the premises shall be delivered to purchaser at closing, subject only to. What was the only to?
Okay, subject only to. What that refers to is if you have, for example, a tenant in there. Or if, in fact, for some reason there's going to be some kind of a delay. But subject to would be, it could be a triplex, for example, and maybe 2 of the units are occupied. That's where you would put that. You would put in there if they're not going to get complete possession and control as of the date of closing. That's a good question. I just failed to cover it. Okay. All right. Now, paragraph 6. It addresses the question about what can happen if someone does not, meaning a buyer does not fulfill their obligations. All right. And what it indicates, it's a standard provision. I don't consider it to be a non-neutral provision, and that's a typical remedy that you're the landlord, you're the seller. In this particular contract, the buyer is obligated to put the premises in their name and pay the taxes, and you find out the taxes haven't been paid, and you find out this baby's going up for tax sale, and you're going to lose it. Well, what this paragraph allows you to do is to go ahead and make the payment to the taxing entity to protect yourself, add it to the balance of the land contract, and, if you wish, send a notice of forfeiture, notice of default, because you had to make that payment. Same thing with insurance. I mean, it calls for them to carry insurance, and for you, if you're the seller, to have a provision whereby the insurer will give you notice as an additional insured if there's going to be a cancellation. Well, you don't want a cancellation, so you would step in, make the payment, add it to the balance of the land contract, and if you want, again, send them a notice of forfeiture, declare them in default. It's important that that be in there, because otherwise, you as a seller don't necessarily have that right. I mean, you may well go pay the property taxes. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a right to add it to the balance of the land contract unless we put that provision in there. Okay.
Does that create a negative amortization?
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the whole situation where we're going to put the, I may be getting ahead of myself, but I do that all day long. Number 5, we have the purchaser entering the premises for taxation in their name and paying taxes as they become due. There's an alternative to this. There's lots of sellers who say, wait a minute, I am not comfortable waking up and suddenly having a big tax bill that now the buyer, the vendee, can't pay, and I got to pay it. So I'm going to set this land contract up so that the buyer is going to make the payments of principal and interest as specified in paragraph 2, and then the buyer is going to make a monthly payment attributable to taxes. So let's say it's $300 a month. All right, and he will be credited against the balance of the land contract for that $300. All right, so we go for 12 months. The buyer has received credit for $3,600 as we've been calculating interest. Now it's time for me as the seller to pay the tax bill. I pay the $3,600. What happens to the balance of the land contract? It goes back up. But that's the traditional way it was handled. It makes the calculation a little bit more difficult, but it does put the seller in control of payment of taxes, and lots of sellers are going to want that control. Okay, so that's a provision that's there. You'll want to have that alternative provision available as opposed to this one. Some sellers, though, they just want to sell the property and go to Arizona and not think about it and not have to deal with it. They just want a check every month. And if that's the case, then they're going to want this paragraph 5. Buyer carries the insurance, buyer pays the taxes. All the buyer does is send me a check. Yes. Oh, just a second. You can't do that. There you go.
Okay. So my question is, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you say. If for example, the buyer is paying you the taxes separately to you, the seller, and you're going to, when the taxes are due, pay from what the buyer has paid, the land contract doesn't go up in value because the buyer has given you that money. If they didn't give you the money, it would go up.
All right, what's happening is this. The buyer has given you money. You're holding it throughout the year.
Yes.
Okay, so you apply that against the balance of the land contract.
Why?
Because they're paying it, they're not getting paid any interest on it, and typically you would reduce the balance of the land contract by that $300, and you're calculating.
Taxes don't have anything to do with the purchase price of a property.
I understand that, but
Okay.
under the law, this money's not being separately segregated.
All right, that's
I'm
where
the seller,
confused.
you're the buyer, you give the money, I put it in my freaking bank account.
Got you.
That's right. No, there's nothing. This isn't like a security deposit, so
okay,
I'm getting
okay.
the benefit of that money all year long.
Right, okay.
No, you could write it up so that the buyer didn't get credit, and if they wouldn't think about it, you might get away with it, and you could. It's not illegal to do that. It's just, I'm just telling you it's a traditional standard way of doing it, so that, again, the buyer gets credit for the fact they've given me money
Got
that I
you,
can do anything
got
I
you.
want with,
Right.
and then I'm going to make the tax payment at the end of the year.
And it's going to come off the price of the land contract?
So when
add
I
to
pay
it?
that $3,600 at the end of the year, the balance goes back up. Okay, because I took that money out of my pocket, and now and so therefore it was just, you said it was just for taxes.
Okay, I just wanted to make
You
sure I
follow
was
me?
understanding. Yeah, thank you.
It only took me about 5 years to get a handle on that, so I'm not suggesting. Yes, ma'am.
So the question is, after you've paid the taxes, or the seller pays the taxes, is there some kind of written notice that they need to provide to the purchaser?
Okay, it's a good question. Typically, always in like the you provide for, if the purchaser's doing it, for the purchaser to provide evidence to the seller that they paid them. The question is, should we have the same thing for the purchaser? Because here's a purchaser sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, I've given you $3,600 and all you've done is drink it up. And now there's no money to pay the property taxes, so I got to pay them to protect myself. All right, so sure, you would most likely, you would want a provision that would indicate the seller to provide evidence that they paid them. There's a lot of mutual trust in this, folks. That's why, again, when we're sitting down and putting our hats on, it's no longer like a, I was going to say one-night stand, but that comes out wrong. But I mean, it's not the short engagement, the short relationship we usually have. Seller meets buyer, buyer pays seller, seller never worries about it again. No, the sellers, we're going to have a fairly long-term relationship here, so we better know each other well enough to make sure we think it's going to work. And that's because of all these assumptions. Let's assume that there's going to be an underlying mortgage. All right? Well, typically, what's the buyer doing? The buyer's trusting the seller to keep making the payments on that mortgage. Because if they don't, and the mortgage forecloses, what happens to the land contract? It's c'est la vie. Unless the buyer can do something about it. Okay, we'll get back to that in a second. Paragraph 7 talks about upon purchaser satisfying their obligations, the seller is going to give them a warranty deed, and the seller is going to pay the transfer taxes. An issue that comes up, and it may well come up with you, is, and it certainly came up in the 80s. You sell the property, the buyer's sending their checks to Arizona faithfully every month for 4 years. They now have made their last payment, and we've got to find the sellers to sign a deed. All right? And it becomes a problem. Now, I will tell you back then, and we'll get to it in the context of another paragraph, but people would sell. I'd sell to you in a land contract. You'd sell to somebody else in a land contract. You'd sell to somebody. We'd have 4 or 5 land contracts deep. And now somebody's actually going to pay at the bottom all the way off, so they all got to be done. So we got to collect 5 sets of deeds. Well, that led lots of people to look at potential for escrow provisions. Okay, you have to find somebody to escrow with, but you would take this, if you were representing a buyer, and say, oh, by the way, upon execution of this land contract, seller will deposit an undated deed granting the property to the vendee, which shall be held in escrow and released to the vendee upon full payment of the purchase price and performance of its obligation.